Well, welcome to our entrepreneur chat and Q&A with Liberty Foreman, who is the CEO and co-founder of Sierra Medical. I'm so excited to have Liberty with us today to talk about her journey from young person in education to a PhD student to developing a technology that can make early detection of lung cancer more accessible and more affordable. So I have a lot of questions for you, Liberty, but first of all, welcome and thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So first of all, before we start with kind of you and your background, your company is Sierra Medical. Can you tell me a little bit about it and what it does?
Yep. So Sierra Medical is a really short version is that we're working on developing a platform that uses a technology called infrared spectroscopy, which is just light. We shine light at samples and then we can get biochemical profiles of them and we can start using that for early disease detection. Doesn't have to be lung cancer. We've got other data for other different cancers, but essentially lung cancer is our first product. And we do that with just using a cheek swab. So we'll take a cheek swab, we look at the biochemical profile of the cheek swab, and then we can tell you whether or not you have lung cancer.
Wow. So not invasive at all. What's the normal, like, since I don't know this, what's the normal procedure for diagnosing lung cancer?
Well, as of 2 weeks ago, they've just introduced a national lung health check program. So actually, if you're at risk of lung cancer, so if you've been smoking for a long time, you live in deprived areas, if you hit a certain number of these factors, you'll be invited to go for a CT scan. And then from the CT scan, they'll look to see what your image looks like, and then they'll follow you down at certain pathways. Maybe they'll ask you to come back next year if it looks okay, or 5 years if it's totally fine, or they'll ask you to come back for a more invasive histo, like a biopsy. Before that, though, and this is only just rolled out, before that it was just symptomatic. You would present at the GP, and by that point, because you're symptomatic, you're probably at stage 4 lung cancer, and then the chance of survival is really quite low, which is why lung cancer is the #1 killer of all the cancers.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's incredible.
Yeah,
okay.
it's bigger than, we need to fact check this a bit, but it's bigger than prostate, colon, and bowel, prostate, colon, and pancreas combined.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
So
it's huge.
this is revolutionary then. That's phenomenal.
Yeah, and what we're trying to do is implement it. So CT scans are a little bit risky anyway, because you've got to have radiographers. It's small amounts of radiation, so you don't want to have that constantly. But also, we don't have the resources in the country, or it's global shortage of radiologists to even run screening programs using CT scans. So we're hoping that what our technology can and serve as is a triaging tool for CT scans. So you would be able to do your cheek swab at home, and then you would post it off to a centralized laboratory, and all of this can be run by one provider, i.e. the NHS, and then you would be triaged from that point. So it's like a decision-making aid. We would never tell a patient at this level, you have cancer, because that's fear-mongering. Obviously, that's left to the professionals, but this is a triaging device.
Right, that makes sense. So tell me then about your background and like, what was your career trajectory to get, and research, honestly, trajectory to get to Sierra Medical?
So I started off not knowing what I wanted to do, apart from the fact that I hated English. And that was literally the only thing I had in my mind. Well, I don't like English, so what am I going to do then? I must be science, because I'm all right at maths, but I'm not great. So I went and did a degree, and I looked down the list of degrees and I thought, do you know what? Genetics looks quite interesting. I might pick that one. So I went on this molecular genetics course and realized at the time that I'm just not very good in the lab. I was too clumsy. I didn't like it. I'm not patient enough. We did 8 weeks worth of lab work and I had to go right back to the beginning. I thought, oh, this isn't for me. And I ended up swapping onto a computational statistics bioinformatics essentially course within that degree program. And I kind of found an affinity for it. And it was the programming side of things that I really liked. So I got to the end of my degree and I thought, well, I've only really done one course in this. If I want to transition into this field, I need to go down that a bit more. So I said, well, might as well do a PhD then. So then I ended up doing a PhD in that sort of area, so computational analytics. And that led me on to, again, I don't really like making choices. So I don't really like making a choice where I'm determined by reading a paragraph. And I think that's what a lot of PhDs are about. You read a paragraph which determines your entire next 3 years. So I did a rotational PhD where I got to spend 3 months. The first year was 3 months in 3 different labs. And that's when I realized I actually started on this infrared spectroscopy project. And I thought, well, this could be good. But there was no computational elements to it. So I approached the supervisor and I said, look, I love this project and I think there's legs in it. Especially I got to see lots of different aspects of this research. So there was clinical, statistics, and biophysics. But there was no statistics element initially. So I approached the supervisor and I said, I really want to do this, but I want this to be computational. Can I redesign the project? And he said, well, if you want. And of course, I think he really did like that because I came with money with the program that I was on. So it didn't matter what I suggested, he was going to say yes. And that was the start of what is Sierra Medical, actually, because that was the beginning of my PhD. I ended up going on to design and run a 122 patient clinical study in colon cancer using infrared. And then by the end of it, I started thinking, well, this could spin out, or I could spin this out. And then I did. And then, 10 years later, I think it'll be 9 years later now. So just about 8-9 years.
Wow.
So that's kind of how it happened.
Yeah.
By mistake.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And I love that it was like your hatred of English that as a former English teacher that propelled you into this. But like really great.
No offense.
I know. So tell me, so Sierra Medical was a university spin out. Tell me about your experience with that as an entrepreneur and like in particular as a female entrepreneur. What was that like?
I always found I've never really felt like I fitted in anywhere. So that was something that I've kind of been battling with. I don't know if battling is the right word, but that's something that I've had to contend with throughout, I guess, my entire life and probably even today. So when I didn't feel like I fitted in within academia, and I really didn't, because I wanted to get away from English and writing, and it turns out that once you get to a certain level, it all comes back to writing papers. And that was just almost like an allergic reaction. I thought, oh no, not writing again. Like, how do I get away from this? God knows how I managed to write the PhD, but I did. And I just thought, it's academia, it's just not for me. And I started to research a little bit, like Google, how do you start a company, or what, and it does help that my stepfather was an entrepreneur. So in property though, but still commercial property, but still it was enough for me to say, oh, can I turn this into a company? And lots of people, especially the academics, said, you can't do that. That's, you rather than saying you can't, it was very much like, oh no, that's going to be too difficult. Like, there are steps to follow. You need to do a PhD, and then you need to do a postdoc, and then you need to do this and that. And I just thought, and I really like it when somebody tells me that I can't do something. So then I just did it anyway. But it was just emerging. I think UCL, I graduated from UCL. They were just starting to have some kind of entrepreneur programs. And I just saw that, I think I was there just at the beginning of them running these programs. So I saw a few and I just decided to give it a go. But I often liken it to a bit like, that game Whack-A-Mole. I would keep putting my head up and say, oh, I'm going to do this. And everyone was like,
yeah.
It was a bit like that.
Yeah, no, I bet. And you're right. They do have, like UCL now, because I work with them, has a ton of kind of encouragement and entrepreneurship and enterprise type programs. But it is also, I think the culture of academia is very much about research. And a lot of academics just can't be bothered to think about starting a business. I mean, I see this in education technology at universities all the time. They want the data and they want their work to continue, but a lot of times once the grant funding is run out, the product, which is amazing, just sits in a drawer. So.
Well, I mean, that was one of the criteria. We tried to, I mean, I have a very interesting story, and if anyone ever wants to contact me about exactly how we managed to get the technology out of UCL without UCL Business having any ownership of what we were doing whatsoever, then contact me, because that's a very unique situation. And the only reason we really managed to do it is by UCLB's own rules. They had to have the supervisor, they had to be an integral part, or they had to want to pursue this as a commercial opportunity. And none of my supervisors wanted to do that. So I was in this situation where I could just cordon off my IP or carve my IP out and put it into a commercial entity. So that's what we did. But I think I tend to go through things with doors open. So my mentality is, well, I'll just keep this door open and see what happens. And I just keep walking. I never really think too much into the negatives of things or too much into the future, because otherwise you just wouldn't do anything. And I just kept thinking, oh, I'll just give this a go, and what's through this door. And then slowly, accelerated, got funding, and then, began the business. So it just sort of happened.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like an incredible journey. We just had our big Breakthrough Labs pitch event on Tuesday. So we are all about pitching on the brain. And I would just love to hear your experience pitching for investment. So like what, do you have any great stories or any horror stories or any advice, or, what do you wish you had known before you started pitching for investment?
I think the biggest thing is you have to be very prepared for all of those no's. And that can be pretty hard hitting. I mean, having started the business of, in its beginning stages in 2000, I mean, technically, I think I've started it in 2015. And I've pretty much been fundraising ever since, and it never stops. Initially, when I went into it, I think, well, we've got this great idea, so obviously people are going to invest. And what was funny at that stage is that within 3 months I raised. I raised through, SEIS, Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme, which I have an interesting opinion of now, and I'm very controversial, and I'm happy to share it. But I don't actually think SEIS should exist, because it did this exact thing to me. It made me think, well, that was easy. I raised within 3 months. I got this 150,000. And then I even managed to raise an EIS round of 600 or 700, but that became much more difficult for other reasons. Investors, always be careful who you go to bed with in investment. But that was much more tricky. But the chasm after that is enormous. Going from trying to raise, after you raise your initial EIS of say 600-700, trying to then jump to like a 3 to 5 million pound raise is a completely different ball game. And I think that what they call the valley of death in life sciences in the UK is, especially for medical devices, is huge. And it's virtually impossible to, unless you get a super amount of grant money, it's really hard to raise that. I know one of the things I wanted to talk to you a little bit about was like how it's like to be a female raising.
Yeah.
And I had never known it to, well, obviously I don't know what it's like not to be a female. But when I first started raising, I was never brought up to think that there was anything a woman could, anything a man couldn't do and anything a woman can do, that they were just equal. So initially I thought, it didn't even cross my mind until people started saying, oh, how does it feel like to be a female entrepreneur? And I was getting really annoyed with this question. Like, I don't know, I'm just an entrepreneur. And then I would go to all these accelerators. Another top tip, if you don't know anything about running a company, the first thing you do is go through an accelerator, I would say. Be careful which ones you choose. Breakthrough Labs is a great example. No, it was a plug, but not on purpose. Definitely pick an accelerator. And I think I met a couple of fellow entrepreneurs within these places, accelerator schemes. And if I look, I then started measuring, because you do, if you're an entrepreneur, you're pretty competitive and you're measuring yourself up against other people. And I started measuring myself up against them. And at first I started thinking, oh, this is going to be a breeze. I've got so much more clinical data. I've got so much better, board. I've got better, all obviously that's what I think. And I started tracking my raise next to their raise. And I started thinking, well, hold on a minute. How have they managed to raise at this point now? The difference is I've probably raised 5 million in total through grants and equity funding. They've raised 25 million at much, much higher valuations. And when I track through how did that happen, I start seeing things like, I'll be in, they don't get the question, how does it feel like to be a man entrepreneur? And you have to face, how does it feel like to be a female? Then you have to sit in board meetings and pitches, and people will say to you, well, I don't think you should wear, try not to put, I've had people say, don't wear your hair like that, or you should dye your hair a different color because you'll look more authoritative, or you should stand in a certain way. If you fidget too much, you're not going to look authoritative. There's all these things that I realized that I had to deal with that they didn't have to deal with. And that made me realize actually there's a huge difference just naturally between what it's like to raise as a female versus a male. It's a really huge difference.
Well, and all the academic research on this kind of thing echoes what you're saying, and all the research we've done at Breakthrough Labs echoes what you're saying. And it's continually shocking to me in this day and age that this still happens, but it happens all the time, all over the world. And it's like all the things, all the kind of questions that you're no longer allowed to ask in job interviews, you can ask as an investor in a pitch. I don't understand. Okay.
Honestly, it makes me feel a bit bitter, and I hate to feel that that's what I would say about myself, but sometimes I do look at other men and I just think this isn't fair.
Yeah.
How is this? What are you doing that I'm not doing that gets you further? And I do think that there are naturally some things that women do that men don't do, and it's just a nature thing. I don't think you have to really try hard to overcome those, but a lot of it is just down to acceptance within like societal acceptance. Like we see a man and we think, immediately they're more authoritative, that they've got better knowledge. It's just something, and it's to fight that is very challenging.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. So I wanted to ask you too, since you're on your company's board of directors as a woman, tell me what that experience has been like for you.
So right now we have a very small board, and I would recommend keeping it that way. If you have a small company, I would recommend not doing, because sometimes you get a lot of advice. Build a big board because you need to look good. I don't think that actually that helps. It makes corporate governance and managing corporate governance really difficult. And also you'll end up making sort of similar mistakes to that as I did previously. So I have had big boards, and I have had situations in board meetings where I have been completely undermined for being a woman. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There was a time when I noticed that one of our fellow board directors was sitting on the board of a competitive company, and I had pointed this out. And at the time, I hadn't had any training in corporate governance, so I didn't know what the actual procedures were to do this. But I raised it, and everyone was sort of, oh yeah, oh dear. And then the next board meeting, I sort of raised it again. I said, we can't have this. And I started to get cross about it, because how can I have an open board meeting sharing information that could then go directly to the company? And it did, by the way. I don't think it was a coincidence that the other company ended up in the same hospital recruiting the same patients under a similar protocol of clinical trial. But I would never be able to prove it, and it could be complete coincidence. Whether it is or not, I'll leave that up to you to think about. But I got cross, And then I got accused of being on my period. And I think that was, at first they said, well, you've got too much estrogen in your system. And I was a bit taken aback. How do you react to that? Like, how would you react to
I
that?
know. Well, that's the thing. You don't expect this in like a normal business environment in this day and
No.
age. I would be caught so off guard. I would have no idea how to respond to that.
Well, I laughed.
Mm.
And I didn't know how you are
Mm.
supposed to react to these things, or, and it isn't until I've had this conversation with a few different people, and apparently laughing is even worse, because you're not calling that person out for being wrong. You're almost encouraging it, because you're in their eyes, you're admitting that it's a joke. That's what you're doing. You're doing this affirmatory kind of response, telling them that it's a joke. And I don't know if that then had an impact, but at the time we were, there was this kind of going on behind the scenes with respect to the company, and was this a conflict of interest, was it not? And then we were also raising, and at the time, and I don't know if anybody else has these similar fears, but I have a fear of getting pregnant, because if I get pregnant, people will automatically assume that I'm not going to carry on with my job, that I'm going to be a stay-at-home mum. And it's something which I never talk about. And in fact, I have been known to joke about it and say, oh, well, I'm never going to have children, because I don't want to accidentally give the impression that I'm not hardworking. And it's preposterous that I would think this way, but it's the way that I feel like I have to, because the majority of people that I'm pitching to are 50, 60, whatever year old men, which are in a completely different generation. And it just so happened that my co-founder at the time got pregnant. And I thought, oh no, what am I going to do? And I remember having a conversation with her saying, like, congratulations, obviously. And I thought, oh no, do you think, what should we do? Do you think I need to do anything? And we just decided no, because I was the face, I was the CEO anyway. So we would just carry on as normal. But in a board meeting, of course, by the same person that had said those previous comments, they said to me, well, you need to put your uterus in a jar. The next investor meeting that you have, you need to put your uterus in a jar. And again, what do? I laughed. And I really kicked myself for laughing, because what that did was do affirmation again, that this is okay. It's okay to say things like this. So then in another situation, not in a board meeting, because that was said in a board meeting, but in a different situation, in amongst peers and colleagues, they said it again. And it was one of these positions that you're like, why should I have to deal with this? Why am I dealing with this? Why am I scared to talk about whether I would become pregnant? Why am I scared to admit that, it's not the same for men, and they don't have to go through all these same things. So it is, unfortunately, that has basically been what it's like to be on a board. And other than that, you have to try 10 times harder for your voice to be heard.
Yeah. That is just an absolute nightmare that you've had to go through that. And I think what's also comes across to me is that you're kicking yourself for laughing. When the person who said this should be, appalled and not be working at their own behavior and not be able to be on boards and not be allowed to people talking to people this way. It's just appalling behavior and completely out of touch. So I think, of course, that's like the natural reaction of women too. Like, what could I have done differently? Like all people are attacked and blame themselves, and what could I have done differently? This is my fault. And in actuality, the person who's speaking this way is the one that's to blame.
Well, I think that you get pushed into that position just by the way that you have to kind of, when you grow up and you come through STEM and you're constantly asking yourself, what can I do differently to get heard? And so you automatically have that disposition. You can't help but have that disposition, because in order to get noticed, in order to get credit for your work, in order to get noticed, to be better than the next person, you do have to do things differently. Your work has to shine brighter than somebody else's. And so you're automatically going to start blaming yourself when your work doesn't shine brighter. And I think that's where it no pun intended, but I think that's where it stems from.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I agree. We're raised to be a certain way, and I mean, I think I would have done the exact same thing as you and kind of laughed off these things, because you just kind of want to smooth it over and keep going, and you're just so surprised by this appalling behavior.
Well, if you don't, you get accused of being argumentative.
Yeah.
It emotional. I've been accused of being emotional before, argumentative, stubborn, bossy. That's another thing. Does a man get called bossy? I don't think a man gets called bossy.
I know.
And these are the sort of like leadership, don't be too bossy. I've been told that on the board as well. Well, you mustn't be too bossy. And it's like, leadership is that's what I'm doing. I've got leadership and accountability. It's not about being bossy.
No. No.
So
I agree. And I've been told by multiple male managers to calm down when I'm like passionate.
Calm down is another one. Yeah.
Calm down. I love that one. Anyway, we'll move on to the next question, because I think you and I could talk about this all day long. But thank you for telling that story. And you mentioned your co-founder, and one of the things that you talked about in the past, which I had not heard this term, was founder fallout. And so I have talked to lots of founders, male and female, who have had co-founders, and sometimes things go remarkably well and everybody's one big happy family, and sometimes things don't. But even if they are going well, working that closely with one other person can be really challenging. So can you tell me about like your experience with co-founders?
Yeah. So when I first started, I did it as a 50-50 relationship with another colleague from university, went doing my PhD, and we never ever. So the word fallout is an interesting one, because I wouldn't ever say that we fell out. And we're not closest of friends. And initially we were never closest of friends to begin with either. But after a while, and I think this is the case for about 90% of founder relationships, that you end up at some point, what you want out of the business or what you want out of life starts to differ. And then you start to have a different perception of how much work you should be doing, or how much steer you want to have in or commercial steer in where the company's going. And at some point it became obvious that I had, I didn't have I wanted this so much that I would do anything for it. And it was my entire life. It was everything that I had worked for, and I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else. And that wasn't the same. The feeling wasn't reciprocated. So you start to, harboring resentment is the wrong phrase, but you start to it starts to become obvious at some point that it's not going to work. And then it's about trying to work together in order to kind of separate, or, separate out. And then all these questions come. Do you keep your equity? Do you not keep your equity? And in the end, and I think this is probably one of the hardest, this is but singly one of the hardest things I've had to deal with within business, which is that as much as you try to not let it be personal, it becomes personal. And I come from a place of, I will often feel guilty about the choices that I make, because I don't want my choices to impact on other people. But then you have advisors around you. You have advisors, and the other person has advisors. Those advisors can be your friends and family, or they can be commercial advisors. And I had a lot of commercial advisors around me saying, you can't have a founder split and retain equity, because you're going to have a controlling minority. And that's what made things difficult. It's the breakdown of how do you even begin to split out that equity. and how much do they get, and do they get any money, and that's a really challenging thing to navigate. I'm glad that I've been through that experience. I'll never, because I know how to then advise others, or I would know how to advise others going through a similar situation. And all experiences, and I think often it's the bad experiences that you go through that you have the most growth. And I've had a lot of bad experiences, so I've had a lot of growth. And I would say that this was one of them. But it's whenever, and biggest piece of advice, this is the biggest piece of advice I could give to anybody thinking about starting a business: never do a 50-50 split, ever. Because there is always one person that will be ultimately more committed than the other. And that is that should be the way that it is. Because you have all sorts of other complications if you do a 50-50 split, which means what happens when there's a disagreement. And we've seen I've come across lots of different people that have done 50-50 splits, and the first thing I would say is never do a 50-50 split.
So, I mean, I never would have thought of that, because of course you think if you're starting this business with one other person and I've never, but it makes sense. It makes sense.
It's not actually fair to do it as a 50-50 split. It's much fairer to do something, and it's not okay to just say, okay, we'll do 51-49. Like, I mean, it has to be, you have to do like a split. And picking your co-founder is, when I don't think this is it's not that this isn't as bad advice, but when you start a business, often if it's your first business, you're not really thinking, who should my co-founder? I think if you're in that position, that's great, because it means that you can really pick someone complementary. But I had complementary personality traits with my co-founder, but we did not have complementary skill sets because we both did a PhD in science. So actually we were considered always one founder split into two. So it was definitely, like, now I have a co-founder who is a CFO, and not only do we have complete like chalk and cheese personalities, which is great for debating things through, but on sounding boards, but also we have completely different non-overlapping skill sets.
Yeah.
And that's a complementary co-founder, I think, that is the most useful to have.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. You want someone who's going to bring something else, some other skills to the table that you don't have, because otherwise you would just do it yourself.
Yeah.
I agree. So when we last spoke, you introduced me to another terminology here, but you said you'd had an interesting conversation with the founder success manager at one of the investors, and I just wondered, like, because a lot of the founders in Breakthrough Lab are having their initial conversations with investors now on the back of the pitch day that we just had. Like, what does that mean in terms of your ongoing relationship with your investor? And tell me about your experience.
So this is the first time I've ever come across this, and I don't know. So our investors are from the US, and I don't know whether this is a bit of a cultural thing, but I've still never come across it before. So we have an investor who has a venture arm. So the ones that the directors that deal with, like, they select the investments opportunities, you go through the investment committee, and then they ultimately make an investment and they do all the negotiations. Once you're through that, this particular early stage investor does not typically, if you go through this, I'm going to call it like the early stage arm of the investments, don't typically take a board seat. And instead, what you have is founder success. And that's a really interesting concept, because if you're new to running a company, it can be really good for guiding. And it also means that they are there to kind of help you. They're reporting. They report up to the investment arm. But it often feels like a bit of a hands-off way of dealing with the investors. But don't worry, everything that you say always comes back to bite you, because it does with every single investor, and you can't do anything about that. But it can be an interesting dynamic having a founder success. I think it's bitter and sweet, I think. But I think for early stage businesses, I think it would really be useful. And I think it's a concept that should be introduced, because you are more likely to talk to someone that you consider to be a little bit more like a peer than you would talk to someone or in a position of authority. But sometimes we have weekly calls. I think it's probably quite a lot. I think might be better to just have them every other week if they're listening.
Weekly does seem like a lot, because how much can change in a week? I mean, maybe, I don't know.
Well,
yeah.
I actually think that is a bit too in all honesty, I think it's a little bit too intrusive. I think you then allow your investors to get a lot of operational control, and I think that's what I don't want to speak for them, but I think that's almost like what they want. But it can be, I don't know if anyone else struggles with this, but often if I'm asked a question, I want to answer it, and I want to answer it honestly and truthfully and transparently. Right. Well, that comes to really be a pain. That's a flaw as much as it is a positive for me. Yeah. So that can put me into some difficult situations, like when someone clearly those relationships, they want to be there for you, but sometimes that can be a little bit intrusive. Yeah,
I bet it can. I mean, and it relates to another question that I want to ask you with all the kind of, it's one more piece of advice basically that you're getting. So through the process of getting support and advice through mentors and family and friends and investors, and so how have you managed to filter the good advice and know and to listen and when not to?
That's a really good question. Earlier today, I sent my partner a message in capital letters screaming, I don't want any more advisors. I want somebody that can actually do something.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
And actually, sometimes you can be absolutely... Advisors are great. Advisors are great as long as you have the resources, either within your team or ones that you can contract externally, to explore that advice. You can't take advice and run with it, because if you ask 10 different people in the same field, they're going to give you 10 slightly different answers. And one of those answers is going to be completely opposite to all of the rest of it. It's going to make you think. So I always think it's good to get advice, but it's really hard to pick which advice you should follow. And I have accidentally at the moment I've allowed myself to become probably over 100%. I'm at capacity, but I've even taken on more because I think, I'll just get some advice about this thing. And then I've ended up starting off like 5 different projects at the same time, regulatory advice, clinical trial advice. Then it ends up clinical trial advice then becomes, you should talk to the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. You should actually talk to a health economist. You should now talk to a statistical analysis plan expert. And then it's, I think I'm liaising currently with in excess of 10 advisors. And the level of resources that you then have to put into consuming that advice is that's a serious amount.
Yeah.
So in the end, I think I would probably, take all advice with a pinch of salt and just go with your gut feeling, and you will make mistakes. Yeah. Hopefully you just try to mitigate them being really, really big mistakes.
Yeah. And you can fix them quickly. Yeah. Yeah. So a couple more questions for you, Liberty. Sure. In the early stages of your business, how did you manage to juggle setting up the business and also having to kind of live? And so at what point were you able to be kind of all in the business? This is a very interesting question, because when I was starting Breakthrough Labs and thinking about it for so long, but still doing all sorts of paying contracts, I had a coach I was working with who said, okay, at some point you have to jump in with both feet. So when are you going to do that? Or else this is never going to happen.
Actually, that's a really good question, because I am advising another business at the moment who are running a sort of virtual reality type VR headset gaming business. So you go there and you rent the head stuff and they help you play games on there. And it's really cool. And they've done a really, really good job. And I'm only really there on the peripherals. But the first time I started working with them, I said, well, you're doing this at weekends and you've got your full-time jobs during the week. When are you going to start? When are you just going to make the leap? And they said, oh, well, the business isn't really earning enough to pay money at the moment. And I said, well, if you don't make that jump, your business is never going to earn you enough money because you're too tired to do it during the week. And at the weekends, you're too tired other than to turn up and actually do the physical work that you have to do there. So I said, because there's two founders, and I said, well, one of you needs to do it full time, and then the other one can try and support. They were a couple as well. I said, you have to at least cut it at some point. I honestly think, and I think you have to just do it straight. I honestly think you have to do it straight away. I don't, but it's easy for me to say that because I was in a situation where I had been earning pants from my UCL scholarship, whatever the stipend that comes with a PhD anyway. I think I got 15,000 a year 10 years ago, living in London. So I was used to basically having, not very much anyway. And I got a little bit of support from my parents. And I don't think, so it's difficult for me to say, I can't sit here and say everyone should go all in because I got a little bit of support from my parents. But I do think unless you really push yourself into it, then you just won't do it. And I had a really, part of this story, I suppose I can't have time to tell this bit. No, I haven't gone into the details, but my one business is actually two businesses. And the original one I was talking about, my co-founder, that was my first business. And because of the mistakes I made, like out of commercial naivety, let's say, I signed agreements commercially that I shouldn't have. And ultimately that ended in the death of the company and I had to liquidate it. So I've been through that process as well, which is another thing to learn from. And when I started it back up again, because I had the support of other investors, because I'd hit the science and technical milestones, they invested in it again. I was absolutely skint at that point. I hadn't been receiving a salary for 2 years, at I think 18 months at that point. And I had a job offer to be the managing director of this other genetics business at the time. And then I had investors saying to me, do you want to start it again? Because we'll put a little bit of money in. And I had this decision that I had to make. Like, am I going to do this again? Because I'm not going to earn any money for at least another year or so. My partner had just finished his MBA, so he was on a student. We had no money between us. We were living off of savings. And his dad was helping us because I had, at this point, exhausted all of my family help, like no more family help from anyone. And I thought, am I mad? I'm going to do it again. And I did do it again, but I've only been being paid for 6 months now. So for the last 6 or 7 years of having a salary, I think I've only really received one for about three years of that. But I still wouldn't do it any differently. And I think you have to really put yourself in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to agree, but also I have support as well from my partner. So it's easy for me to say, but I know because I would not be able to do what I'm doing to the level of quality or to the extent. Yeah, I know. Okay, last question, Liberty. Where would you like to take Sierra Medical in the future? And what do you see as the biggest challenge in getting there?
Well, the vision is quite easy. So I've always wanted, infrared spectroscopy is what the kind of basic technology that's involved behind the company. I mean, we just use commercially available. My business is a software business. And the dream is to have what is essentially a conveyor belt of product coming. So I quite like being in the R&D space, commercial R&D space, not like academic. And we've got this lung cancer, we can do colon cancer, we can do breast cancer. So I just want to churn out products. I want to do rare diseases. And this platform that we're creating has the potential to translate to other diseases. The conveyor belt at the other end of the conveyor belt, I want to use, whether we separate these off as different companies or whether we license them, I'm not entirely sure. But at the other end of the conveyor belt, another company will pick up either the company as a whole, and I just start making subsidiaries that we sell out, or we use distributors to do the other kind of commercial sales aspect of it. And I feel like that's my sweet spot, because scaling a business to be a global kind of, sales, selling it into hospitals, that's a completely different ball game. And I quite like the industry that I'm in. I want to be a much bigger and more successful version of what we've got. So that I think is what we want to be. There are two of the biggest what I think our hurdles facing. The easy one is funding, so let's just park that one to one side. I think the thing that I think I'm personally going to struggle with is navigating the political landscape, because being in a health company, a healthcare company or diagnostics medtech company, there's an awful lot of politics that floats around, with policies, healthcare policies, trying to be we're a tiny little minnow in what is this huge big pharma kind of industry, and navigating all of that is going to be incredibly challenging.
I can only imagine. Yeah, it is just a massive 800-pound gorilla pharma and all.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, absolutely. Well, Liberty, I can't thank you enough for this today. I really, really enjoyed our conversation. And thank you so much for sharing your story and your journey. It's fascinating. And I wish you nothing but success with Sierra Medical. So
thank you very much. Thank you.